A multi-stakeholder effort, the Paris Call for Trust and Responsibility in Cyberspace, that includes governments but also includes civil society, individuals, and firms. So we have a multilateral and a multi-stakeholder effort to deal with this problem. The third and really last really interesting effort around this space right now is the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, and that one is distinctive because it's neither multilateral nor multi-stakeholder. It is private governance. It is companies reaching an agreement together and then publicizing the agreement and opening it for further adherence by other firms to do things including not assisting governments with hacking civilian targets. Which raises a whole host of interesting questions that I hope we can discuss today. So we have multi-stakeholder, multilateral, and private governance efforts underway here, and it's really interesting to see different modalities of governance being used, and it's sort of, I think, a really interesting question, how these will be implemented and maintained and operated on a going forward basis. So with that sort of stage setting in mind, I want to introduce our panelists, and starting from the far end, we have Eric Wenger, Director, Cybersecurity and Privacy Policy, Global Government Affairs, Cisco. We have, sitting next to him, Trey Herr, Senior Security Strategist, Microsoft. We have Greg Nojeim, who is the Director of the Freedom, Security, and Technology Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. We have Amie Stepanovich, who is U.S. Policy Manager and Global Policy Counsel for Access Now. My name is Mark Raymond. I'm Wick Carey Assistant Professor of International Security at the University of Oklahoma and Director of the Cyber Governance and Policy Center. And sitting to my left is my good friend and mentor, Laura DeNardis, who is Professor and Co-Director of the Internet Governance Lab at American University. So we have a fantastic panel here today. And what I thought we might do is ask the two corporate representatives to lead off and say what they can about these efforts and sort of how they understand these kinds of efforts, how they're working to implement them, what they think that they mean, and how governments have responded to them. And so after we sort of get the corporate view, and after they tell me why I'm wrong on all of this stuff, I'm sure, we will turn it over to Amie Stepanovich and then to Greg Nojeim, and we will finish up with Laura DeNardis. So that's kind of our order of operations. We'll be passing microphones around at least a little bit. But Eric, if you're willing, if you would lead us off.
Sure. So I think one of the things I wanted to key off of is you said that, that we're looking here at a private industry perspective on government activity. And I think that that's an interesting point to start, because it begs the question, why are private sector companies in the position that they're in? And it's because we have increasing demand from governments to gain access to information that they need in the course of law enforcement investigations that are in the hands of third-party companies. And so we have this concept of the third-party doctrine, and really whether or not information that is in the hands of a third party that you have voluntarily shared that information with enjoys the same levels of protection from a legal perspective, from a constitutional perspective, as if you were holding this information yourself. Our perspective at Cisco, and I was at Microsoft before. Trey will speak more about what Microsoft believes, but I can say my experience there was that companies in our space very commonly believe that we want to extend the same sorts of legal and constitutional protections for information that is in the hands of third parties as it would enjoy in your own possession. And the reason is because people will not use cloud-based services if they believe that there's one level of protection that is accorded that information if they hold it themselves, and another lower level of protection that is accorded to it if you put it somewhere else in the cloud. And the decision making is not all that apparent to people, that when you're storing something, you're using Google Docs or Word, and you hit save, where you save it should not make a difference in terms of what level of legal protection is accorded to that information. So whether it's stored on this device here or on my personal computer at home as a result of hitting a button, or in the cloud, we'd like to see the legal protections be equal across them. But we cannot escape the fact that we're talking about this also in a post-Snowden environment, where there's been a lot of awareness that's been raised around government activity in order to try to get information from private sector companies, either through legal frameworks or using government's own authorities to try to get access to information without the companies even being aware of it. And we saw examples of both of those things through the Snowden leaks. And at that time, when I was at Microsoft, one of the things that a group of companies came together to try to work on was the idea of creating greater transparency about how these programs worked, so you could get a sense of whether the level of rigor associated with them was the kind that you would feel comfortable with, and the frequency with which these demands take place, and the nature and type of information that is obtained by the government. And there was initially a very strong pushback from the government around revealing even numbers about the frequency with which they were making demands. So some companies, I see Jeff Ratner from Apple, who's going to be part of the workshop later, brought lawsuits against the government, and then a group of companies came together under the banner of something called Reform Government Surveillance in order to try to push for changes to the USA Patriot Act in what later became the USA Freedom Act. And those changes largely revolved around creating greater transparency and as well creating some restrictions on things that were beyond what the public and what Congress actually expected when the USA Patriot Act was passed. When I came to Cisco in 2014, we started to focus on a different range of issues that were not covered by the changes to the USA Freedom Act. And they related to things like government interdiction or interference with delivery of products from companies to their customers. And we realized that there were a range of issues that didn't fit neatly within the types of reforms that were being sought through the USA Patriot Act, USA Freedom Act, reforming the USA Patriot Act. Things like stockpiling of vulnerabilities, hacking that was conducted by the government, interference with the development of encryption algorithms, which there were allegations of, the potential for the government to undermine the reliability of certificates and certificate issuing authorities or update mechanisms. And so one of the things that I noticed about all those issues is that they were not easily of the type that you could reform along the lines of what was accomplished with the USA Freedom Act, because these are not the kinds of authorities that a government would credibly say that they would never do. And what we wanted to try to focus on are what are the frameworks that govern the government's ability to engage in these kinds of activities, and what sorts of transparency mechanisms should be available to let the public know that these kinds of things happen. And so, so we have done some work in that space, and I think that is one of the reasons we were interested in the development of the Cyber Tech Accord and the Paris Call, is that they start to shift the conversation a little bit away from not just what the government can and should be able to do, but under what circumstances the government should be able to engage in certain kinds of behaviors, what are the norms of behavior, and then as a reciprocal to that, what are the kinds of things that companies should be promising about how they're going to protect their customers? Because it's really a dialogue, a conversation about the balance of normative behaviors between both the private sector companies that are stewards of this information and then the government agencies that are trying to potentially gain access to the information in the course of their efforts to try to fight crime and terror.
No, I think that's great. Thanks, Eric. I think it's a great way to start the conversation. I mean, why are we here? Fundamentally, the relationship that we have with our technology has changed in the last 10 years. It's no longer accessory to the experience. It's fundamental, I think, for most people to it. And so, as a result, the sorts of social and political compromises that we've made over the years are beginning to be applied to these devices, and through these devices and these services, thus these companies. So the kind of discussion that we're having is a manifestation of this, right? Tech companies play a major role in governing those sorts of social and political compromises on their technology. The one in particular today is this question of hacking, government hacking, and access to your data and to others' data and targeting of civilian systems. So I think, at least from our perspective, there's three big pieces for what's going on here. Why are we having these sorts of conversations? Why is this important now? What's actually going on, and to what end is it working? Is it trying to achieve something? So focus just on that first piece, the why. In our mind, there's two really principal problems, or two principal discussion points. The first is trust, and the second is consequence. Going back to that idea of this technology being so inimical to our experience, the trust that you have in these services and these companies determines the degree to which you integrate a product or a service into your experience, right? That you're willing to trust it, not just with data, but with personal data, with sensitive healthcare information, with tax records. There's a trust between you and these devices that's necessary for them to be a pervasive part of your experience, for them to be a part of your life in any way. I wouldn't trust my cell phone with more than numbers of people I had just met if I didn't trust that it was able to securely store those and protect them, right? Not just from random strangers, but from concerted attempts to access that information in ways that weren't lawful. So I have a trust with this technology, and maintaining that trust requires tremendous amount of effort. So there's actions by, and I think we're going to talk about them today, companies in particular to try and reassert where their responsibility sits in determining that balance of trust and restoring in some cases where it's been brought under attack, but in more particular case, trying to defend against efforts by governments in some cases to undermine that trust. Which leads us into the second point of consequence. One of the reasons that we're seeing more activity in this space is that there have been efforts to bring substantially more harmful effects to cyberspace in the last 5 to 10 years than were the case during its early period of inception. The WannaCry and NotPetya incidents are two in particular that have driven public attention to the kind of systemic and catastrophic consequences that can be obtained from deliberately malicious action in cyberspace. There is an effort by private companies to try and address not just the scale of those consequences, but their direct harm on vulnerable populations. So I think that's the kind of work that's being done, is focusing on building and restoring and strengthening that trust relationship, but also in trying to limit the consequences of these harmful attacks, these harmful events. So that's the why. What's the what? And I think Mark mentioned and Eric talked about a little bit of the two that are most prominent for us, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord and the Paris Call. The Tech Accord is more than 100 companies that have come together and are attempting to articulate a set of principles and actions by which they're going to establish this trust relationship, strengthen and really maintain this trust relationship with their customers and with users. So the Tech Accord lays out some principles in terms of secure design and delivery of services, tries to broaden those principles to a larger community, right? Brings the goal forward for that group of 100 companies that they're going to take those principles and work with civil society and others other than just industry to try and implement them. The Tech Accord is a vehicle for consensus building as well as for promulgation of some of these ideas, some degree of entrepreneurship. And I think, as Marty and others have talked about, some of the chief value in a norms entrepreneurship process is not just the end state, right, of a new practice or behavior, but is actually this consensus building around language and goals and common understanding. And the Tech Accord, we think about the private sector as a very kind of black box, almost unitary phenomenon, but it's not. There's a tremendous amount of rich diversity in the character and the culture of these companies, of their objectives and the way they think about these problems, and especially for smaller firms, right? These sorts of broad policy issues are not what they've been set up to worry about. If you're a 10-person startup with a great idea of selling a cool database service, your first problem, your first objective is not going to be, what are the implications of my product for international peace and stability? Right? It's not going to come to the front of your mind. And so part of this is an effort to bring that conversation and bring that maturation to companies that haven't necessarily had the chance or the time or the opportunity to really think about it. The Paris Call is a much more multi-stakeholder effort. It includes governments, individuals, major organizations around the world, and is an effort to try and address some of those same issues from a principled perspective on what it is that this community does not want to see taking place in cyberspace to try and reduce the consequences of these sorts of systemic harmful attacks and the sort of malicious or manipulative behaviors that we see from some actors in this space. The Paris Call is a start of that process, and I think the Tech Accord as well. They're not end states in and of themselves. They're not the final objective in these longer discussions. And so to get to that third point of to what end, our position, I think Microsoft's as well as the position of this kind of work, is to try and drive a substantial change in our relationship with cyberspace. As governments become more assertive, as tech companies have to take on more responsibility for governing how this space is actually designed and operated as well as executed in your own experiences of your own devices, there has to be a reevaluation of just how important certain values are relative to security and to privacy and to our understanding of our relationship with these devices. Right? It's our position, it's those of the companies that are involved in this process, that individual security, individual privacy are paramount in how we're driving these sorts of changes, and those are interests that need to be represented in the broader international security discussion. So that's just an inject here, and I know we got a lot more to say, so I'll pass it on down the line.
Hi, everyone. I'm Greg Nojeim with the Center for Democracy and Technology. We're a nonprofit organization here in Washington, D.C., and we're all about free speech and privacy on the internet. And I want to thank AU and Mark and the other panelists for coming. It's really important for us to be able to co-sponsor this event. and it's flattering to us that you turned out or tuned in to see it. And I particularly want to thank Mark and Trey for coming out and speaking from the company perspective. Sometimes that's difficult to do in an open forum, and I think we have to recognize that. And I do want to also give, I think, special kudos to Microsoft, because they are forcing discussions of uncomfortable issues. And they are doing it in a very, I think, positive way. The notice litigation that you guys filed, forcing the discussion about cross-border data demands, and now this discussion about government hacking. Microsoft is really pushing the envelope, trying to push us to think about these things in a substantive way, and I think it's very healthy. I want to step back for a second, and we don't have anybody from law enforcement on the panel, so I'm going to put on a law enforcement hat for just a minute and try to speak from that perspective and from the national security perspective. It used to be when security officials or law enforcement officials wanted to get information that was relevant to their missions, they would go to a house, go to a person, and conduct a search. Nowadays, we're living our lives online. And so when they want this information, it's usually stored and available from a service provider, a communication service provider, or it's on a device that a person might hold, or it might be obtainable in transit, something that they can intercept in transit. So law enforcement and national security investigations have changed. They have accommodated these changes in technology. And really what we're talking about here is, what's the extent of that accommodation supposed to look like? It's always been the case since wiretapping and since the collection of information from storage has been on the agenda for national security and law enforcement officials. It's always been the case that there was some level of provider assistance that could be sought. And provider assistance, in theory, it's not a bad thing. Because what's the alternative? The alternative is that law enforcement shows up at the provider's office, at the place where the data is stored, and shows up with guns drawn and says, let us in, we want to get this data. The alternative to that is compelling the provider to assist. So from law enforcement's perspective, and I think a lot of times from the provider's perspective, some level of compulsion is not objectionable. But what we're talking about here is, I think, a different level of compulsion. It's having the providers assist with cyber attacks that may not be for the purpose of collecting evidence of crime, that may not be for the purpose of immediately protecting the country against a threat, but rather have a broader scope. And this is, I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem from law enforcement and national security perspective is that increasingly, as they encounter communications, they are finding them encrypted. And when the communications content is encrypted, then it's not so useful to the person who's trying to seek it. How do you get the unencrypted version, or how do you draw intelligence from that which was not encrypted? So for example, shows where it's going may not be encrypted and may be available to law enforcement, even if the content isn't. So they've got this eating communications for their mission of encountering encryption, and now they're, in my view, pushing the envelope on what is the type of provider assistance that they can expect and compel in order to assist with their problems. And think of it in three buckets. There's the efforts to gain access to a consumer's device. There's the efforts to intercept communication in transit. And yet there are the efforts to hack the data in unencrypted form. So one thing that has concerned us greatly in this area is what other countries are doing. Other countries are pushing the envelope on this issue. In the United Kingdom in 2015, they adopted legislation to enable the law enforcement and intelligence officials to get what they call equipment interference warrants. Equipment interference is another name for government hacking. They got the authority to get these warrants to allow for this equipment interference in bulk. That means that it's not targeted to the particular person that they're trying to surveil, but that it's done on a much broader basis. To get the authority, they promised Parliament this will only very rarely be used. Most of the time when we seek this assistance, it will be targeted. They just sent up a letter late last year saying, things have changed, more communications are encrypted, we're going to be doing this more often, this bulk equipment interference. So, and it's done very secretly. We don't know the extent of it, and there's very limited information about it. I think that's one of the things that concerns us from both a privacy and from a security perspective.
Hello. My name is Amie Stepanovich. I am, as introduced, U.S. Policy Manager at Access Now. We are an international group. We look at the intersection of human rights and tech. And unlike Greg, I left my law enforcement hat at home today. Not that I necessarily even own one. So I'm going to focus specifically on our perspective, which is how human rights come into this topic. How Access Now started getting involved back in probably 2015 now. Time has started to run together these past few years. I don't know why. Access Now published a report on government hacking and how human rights can be implicated by government hacking. And what we did is we looked at the history of the activity, and we saw that it was starting to really ramp up and increase. Oddly enough, we noticed, and this I'll come back to at the end, that Australia had what we thought might be the earliest law on government hacking. We traced the law back to the 1990s, but because of the way Australia works, and because, as you can tell from my lack of accent, I am not in fact Australian, it was really difficult to figure out when they started using it in a way that involved hacking activities, since it predated those. We ended up dividing government hacking activities from what we saw historically into three different categories. Hacking to cause harm, hacking to control messaging, and hacking for surveillance purposes. And after looking at human rights law and policy in these three areas, what we realized is it was necessary to protect human rights to implement a presumptive ban in the first two categories, in all three categories, really. And that potentially that ban could be overcome in the third category, hacking to conduct surveillance, if incredibly robust protections were put into place in law. Fast forward a few years, not only have we not seen any government really implement those protections, we're actually going very quickly in the other direction. We had a chance with Italy. There was a pretty progressive law proposed in Italy a couple years ago, and unfortunately that died without getting passed, which we thought was a huge missed opportunity, and Italy ended up going more toward the negative direction. And so we continue to look at this and see what can happen. And unlike traditional areas where governments have faced off against other governments, people really are at the heart of the internet. Just north of Washington, D.C., if anybody has visited the Gettysburg battlefields, it's really interesting. If you hear them talk about it, they'll tell you one civilian was killed in the Battle of Gettysburg. One civilian. A bullet went stray, went into somebody's house, and a woman was standing there making bread, and it ended up striking her and killing her. Now, if you think about the internet era and how the internet interacts and how we use it every single day, the consequences of governments using the internet to go after one another could be disastrous for everyday people. And I would counter, Trey said that people use devices because of trust, I think. kind of summary of what you said. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think people use devices because we have to be in society today. The services and the devices that most of you have in front of you, I'm considering that those of you who are watching this on stream also all have devices in front of you, since you are in fact watching this on stream. Those are really necessary for modern life. And so having real rules is really important. And we think those need to come from governments, but coming from the private sector could get us a long way. And we think that the three documents that we're talking about today, the Tech Accord, the Digital Geneva Convention, and the Paris Call, are all positive steps in the right direction. Access Now actually signed the Paris Call. We've written a long report evaluating the Digital Geneva Convention and the Tech Accord, which is a long report. So if you haven't read it, I will not hold that against you. And came out with the idea that these are really good efforts, and we're applauding the minds behind those efforts. We do think that they could use improvement. And among the things that I would recommend is putting human rights back at the heart of these documents. At no point at the high level are human rights made a central element, and that we think would be absolutely necessary, not only because of the impact on people, but because some of the provisions in these documents could actually hinder human rights if implemented in the wrong direction. And implementation here is going to be key, and I think that's where the discussion largely will go, is how these things can be implemented. So for example, there is a section on intellectual property, preventing the misappropriation of intellectual property. That could have, if implemented in the wrong way, could have huge implications for freedom of expression, for privacy, for a lot of different human rights that you would have to interfere with in order to track who is getting access to different types of intellectual property and how that's being used and distributed. So our highest recommendation is putting that human rights language right up at the top as a central element, not necessarily as a consideration, not to be put in place when implementing, but as a tenet that needs to be followed and protected. And then the last point I want to end on is I want to caution the ultimate impact that these documents could possibly have. So Greg talked a lot about the UK IP Act, and I would have said that the IP Act was probably one of the worst bills I had ever read until I came across the Assistance and Access Law that was passed in Australia in December, which is in fact the worst law I have ever read in my life, not even like ever. And the law was passed in December. It was passed with the idea that it would be revisited this year for amendments. As of yesterday, the story I read is those amendments that we will necessarily revisit in the first quarter of 2019 are not going to be revisited until at least April or May. And they are already using the authorities in that law and are very close into entering into agreements with several different unidentified companies in order for those companies to do any number of quote-unquote acts or things, of which basically anything qualifies. And so the Australian government has asked, under the authority that allows them to enter into voluntary agreements, has asked these companies to do something that we will never know. Those companies have complied, and we will not know what the companies are or what changes are made. And in light of transparency, companies cannot even say, if they wanted to, that they have never complied with a order or a request under this law. Because even saying that they've never received one is a violation of the law and would subject somebody, potentially, to jail time to say that they have never received something. So having these agreements and the Tech Accord, that's really wonderful, but when you come up against a law that says you have to comply, you can't say you haven't complied, you can't say you have complied, and we can apply, some other foreign government can come to Australia, any foreign government, doesn't have to have a minimal protection or standards in law, can go to Australia and say, can you implement this for us in order for us to conduct some sort of investigation into a serious breach of law, And Australia can use that for foreign governments as well. And so that could be the United States, that could be China, that could be Russia, that could be Saudi Arabia. We have no idea what foreign governments may want to take advantage of this. And so I think this is a very important conversation to have, but I want to caution that it can only go so far in light of these expansive laws that we're seeing passed in the UK and Australia and in other places as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura DeNardis. I'm a professor at American University in the School of Communication. But a little over 3 decades ago, I was an engineering graduate student who experienced the first internet outage in the fall of 1988. And it really hit me when it went down. And it got traced back to my university, and it got traced back to the building that I was in, Upson Hall, and it got traced back to a graduate student named Robert Morris, who now we call it the Morris worm. What I noticed is how it affected me, but also how the feds started coming around, how it led to the foundation of the first computer emergency response team, how the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was leveraged to prosecute. I was so taken aback by the entire multi-stakeholder aspect of it that I was hooked on the issue of the politics of technical architecture, and I've been either designing technology architecture or studying it since that time. So that's the backdrop of the studying that I do. What I've noticed, especially in the last 10 years, is that control of cyber infrastructure has absolutely become a proxy for political power. This is true from social control to censorship to cyber war and even global economic competitiveness. Government hacking is part of this broader story. In fact, this was the subject of our Internet Governance Lab book, the Turn to Infrastructure in Internet Governance, that we published, Professor Cogburn, a couple of years ago now. But the trajectory has been clear. The trajectory has escalated. We see this, going back years to DDoS attacks on Estonia and on alternative media. Everything from that to Stuxnet to local DNS redirection for intellectual property rights enforcement to calls for encryption backdoors, or recently the Zimbabwe government shutting down the internet. So the infrastructure control is absolutely a proxy for political power. There are many technical levers of control that come into play here, but it often equates to the privatization of infrastructure control, the privatization of governance, and the privatization of government hacking, just simply because the private industry owns and operates the majority of the infrastructure that keeps the internet operational. So that's just a fact. It's rarely possible, sometimes is, but rarely possible for governments to exert control without somehow tapping into some aspect of the private sector. Now, what I was asked to do is talk about how changes in the technical architecture are changes in arrangements of power around this issue. I can't resist throwing out a couple of, maybe 3 provocations about how the Internet of Things will affect this discussion. And I just finished, when I was on sabbatical, a new book on IoT governance, which is coming out this year with Yale University Press, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. Now, everyone knows that the internet is no longer a communication network or just a communication network. It's a control network in which more things than people are connected, from automobiles to home appliances to the industrial IoT. Now, how will that affect this issue, this intersection of the private sector and government hacking? Well, the first way it will affect it is that there's a shift in what counts as private sector actors in this space. All firms are now technology firms, not just what we consider to be tech firms. Distinctions, we often talk, at least in the European Union, they say GAFAM, right? Google, what does that stand for? Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon and Microsoft, right? The GAFAM, and we'll say GAFAM-C Cisco, right? So these are what we think of as tech companies. But the distinctions between tech company and non-tech company, there's no longer a meaningful distinction, because all firms gather data, all firms rely on technology for their core processes, all firms embed cyber elements into their products and their services. So that changes the equation of this and who should be at the table in some of these agreements. Now, it's clear that the boundary is blurred. It's especially the case if you think about even simply private sector actors who are users of technology and who are affected by things like theft of intellectual property. You know, they're affected, and their cybersecurity measures are as important as what we think of as traditional tech firms. So that's the first provocation. The second one has to do with the stakes of this. The public interest implications of the IoT are considerable. Hacking or a disruption is no longer about taking down access to knowledge and content or even the economy. It could result in loss of human life. When you think about how the internet is in everything, that's the name of my book, The Internet in Everything, and then there's a big long thing after the colon, I'll spare you. But the human safety issues are considerably heightened here. So it's not just about privacy, which is incredibly important. It's not just about speech issues. It's not just about national security, but human safety. Privacy is escalated considerably when you think about hacking that involves intelligence gathering or surveillance that isn't just mediated by a screen, but mediated in all the things around us where there's no screen and we may not have even signed terms of service. There may not even be a private contract. In the bedroom, in the car, in the home, in the workplace. So the privacy issues highly escalated. That's why it's so important to have this discussion, and I applaud and thank Mark and Greg and Derek and Ken for organizing this. So there's that radical escalation of human rights and public policy concerns. Third and final provocation I'll toss out is Dr. Heal Thyself, is how I would say it. What the IoT brings to this discussion is that the question of what can the private sector do in their own terrain, having nothing to do with government hacking. If you improve cybersecurity in the IoT, and improve privacy in the IoT space, then this improves the discussion of everything that we're talking about. From Homeland Security to NIST, to the Internet Society, to standard-setting organizations, to independent researchers, it is clear that the Internet of Things is not yet adequately secure. So there's a tremendous opportunity here if the private sector writ large, I'm not talking about traditional tech companies, but the private sector that's involved in the design of these and the sale of these products, improve cybersecurity, even just simply designing in cybersecurity from product inception or having products that are upgradable, and I could list 20 other things that would help this discussion tremendously. Along those same lines, in Industry Heal Thyself, why is it that governments can access so much data? It's because of the data gathering practices of private companies that, whether you call it massive corporate data gathering or data aggregation or surveillance capitalism, or whether you call it, just in the case of the IoT, the data that is necessary for things to operate. Data gathering and feedback is endemic from an engineering perspective to the very nature of those systems.
and the judge has signed off and said, yes, there's probable cause, and all the requirements of the statute have been met, and there's no other alternative for law enforcement to get it. The provider gets all this and says, okay, this looks like it meets the standards. I'm going to assist law enforcement with this. I want to distinguish that from the situation where the government steals the data without the active assistance of the provider. It cuts into a cable underseas and steals the data. It did this, for example, with backups of data from data centers for Google and for Yahoo. And Edward Snowden revealed this in 2013. The government steals the data. That's a different scenario, right? But the one that's the most interesting and difficult to me is when the government goes to the provider and says, well, we don't have this wiretapping order approved by a judge. We have the authority to compel you to help us break into that cable, that stream of data. We have the authority to compel you to help us get access to this person's device. Now, I think we're in a different territory. Do they have probable cause? Well, no. We want it for intelligence reasons. Is it does the country that's making the demand on the provider even have the authority over the person whose data it's seeking? I think we want the providers to be asking those questions and to, as is the language in the Cyber Tech Accord, to resist when the government is seeking assistance with an attack on an innocent target. And to my mind, the use of bulk equipment interference is by definition that attack. It's by definition that. So I think we need to really start focusing in on that kind of problem.
Fantastic. So our last crosstalk opportunity to Amie Stepanovich, and then we will welcome your comments and questions for our panelists.
Thank you. I'm just to push back on that a little bit, because I think I want companies to be making those decisions internally, but I actually want judges to be making them first. And I think a lot of what we have in the U.S. legal system, or had at one point before all of this newfangled technology became an issue, was a process by which you would go to a judge, you would show that you had the requisite level of proof, you have provided what you need, you have a target in mind, not even just even a target in mind. You talk about innocent targets, just somebody that you're going after. And the judge would make the decision. And then if the judge made the wrong decision, you would have an appeals process, and you could go up to other judges, and you could go through that process, and the companies had that available to them. When you take it out of the legal system, as you do when the government goes straight to the companies, you're creating this relationship of animosity directly between governments and companies, where companies can either give the governments what they want or become the enemy. And I don't necessarily know if that's the right place to be in. It is definitely the place that we're heading to, because we say that the U.S. has authority for government hacking. I would say that they don't. They definitely have wiretap authority, but we've never implemented a law directly on point for hacking. Australia is, but it's not a judge-approved system. The UK has an entirely different system. And we are not thinking through the very unique aspects of government hacking that we should be thinking through in those laws in order to give the decision-making to the judge that they should be doing before going to a company, who can then choose to push back or not to push back. But I think we're giving a lot of power and entrusting a lot of responsibility to companies that it shouldn't be theirs in the first instance.
Fantastic. So I will steal one bit of chair's prerogative and sort of add one complication to the debate here, which is that I think for understandable reasons, a lot of the discussion is revolved around sort of the imaginary of what is the United States government doing, or what is the Australian or the British government doing. And obviously, you know, these kinds of Five Eyes countries with heavy rates of internet penetration, extremely high incomes relative to most other countries on the planet, right? There's a reason we're thinking about them first. They're moving relatively rapidly here. We heard mention of Germany as well, but we have a global enough internet ecosystem that we have a lot of firms that are involved in emerging markets, that are involved in countries with very, very different cultures about what kinds of authorities governments have and whether they even really have a judicial system that's independent in the way that we think of, that would have any kind of redress or appeal mechanism or anything like that. And so I want to make sure as we discuss this with our audience that we're thinking a bit more globally, because given the global nature of the internet technology, it's just not the case that any government can sort of set up its own legal jurisdiction and ensure that that will be the set of rules that governs its citizens globally. There are going to be requests from other stakeholders and other kinds of governments. And so how do we help companies make sure that they're not put in the position of getting an assistance request that turns into, for example, the next Jamal Khashoggi, right? The next Khashoggi case, where someone's communications are compromised, maybe through a government effort to compel, and that eventually leads to something including the death of an individual. That's not a place where any company wants to be, but it's not anything that any one government can prevent either. So just food for thought as we turn to our audience. So I want to welcome your comments and questions. I think Ken is going to assist us by taking a microphone around. So if you would like to ask a comment or ask a question or offer a comment, please raise your hand. Yep, right here, please. Oh, and if you could tell us who you are, please, for the audience at home.
Sure. Hi, is this on? Hi, Sharon Bradford Franklin with New America's Open Technology Institute. So I want to thank you all for putting on this event and thank all the panelists, and join in Greg's comments that it's to be applauded that the tech companies are going into this space and trying to put out these statements of principles and commitments to regulate this kind of activity, and that's very welcome. But my question and is particularly for Eric, but also for Trey, and I may have misunderstood some of your framing, Eric, but as I understood it, you were distinguishing between the USA Freedom Act, which put in place certain rules and had some important reforms, and then you said now you're moved to this other bucket of issues where it's maybe not as easily reformed with legislation. And I'm trying to understand, I mean, obviously there's a political will element, and can you ever get anything out of Congress element, and the unique moment post-Snowden with a sunset, compelling USA freedom. But beyond that, beyond the political will, and can Congress ever enact anything, how you're distinguishing these issues from USA freedom, because it seems to me, while it's great when the companies try to fill a void and have statements in the tech accord about pushing back against illegal government requests or inappropriate government requests, can't we try to nuance this and have a kind of Title III for government hacking, or couldn't there be legislation that would parse out what those circumstances were if we could only get it passed? And I'm trying to understand if there's some other distinction you're drawing there.
No, I think you raise an interesting question, and I've had debates about this very issue with some people, including Heather West from Mozilla Foundation, about whether some of these things are amenable to being dealt with in legislation. And so what I mean is that what the Snowden leaks revealed were programs that already existed. 702, 215 dealt with, in turn, the collection of information about specific indicators under 702 or metadata under 215. And so it was easy to have a conversation. It was hard to develop the legislation, but it was easy to have a conversation about whether or not it should be 2 hops or 3 hops of information that was collected under for metadata, or what are the buckets of information that should be allowed to be reported out about the collection of information. Should it be a 6-month delay with bands of 100 or 500? We had very discrete things we were trying to, and so they were very amenable to being dealt with in terms of regulation. What I mean, the other issues that I've largely listed are the kinds of authorities that the government essentially claims the right to do in the U.S. under the Executive Order 12333. And so it's a very general range of authority where the government says that it has the ability to protect, for national security purposes, engage in certain kinds of activities, and they're not listed. And so therefore it's harder to limit them, and you know this, right? So that's what I'm getting at. But I think you could certainly pick out some of these issues and say, okay, so if we're going to have a government hacking authority, we should explicitly say that that authority exists and then create a set of limits like we have with the Wiretap Act. That's an example. Maybe you could move from category B over to category A, whether it should be, right? And I've had the debate specifically I had with Heather at Mozilla was about the vulnerability hacking, vulnerability stockpiling. My view was that the government would never say that they couldn't engage in these kinds of activities, and the best we could do. She wanted to see a legislative approach, and the bill that was introduced by Senator Schatz from Hawaii called the Vulnerability Equity Review Board, VERB, it was the acronym. The Patch Act, right, exactly. The Patch Act was something you could, and I was skeptical whether or not you could ever advance legislation in the space. I could see now that the idea has been advanced, and I see Marshall here, that that's a possibility as well. So, but my larger point was that I think there are some things that are easier to deal with in a legislative frame, and some things that are harder to deal with in a legislative frame. I did want to, if you had a follow-up, I wanted to give you the opportunity to do that. But I also wanted to address one thing that Greg said before, now that I have the mic in my hand, before I give it back up, is that you said you were focused on the activities that the government can engage in on its own. And I think that sort of relates to this question about, what are the authorities that the government should be able to engage in. The assistance and access law in Australia, the split that we have between the authority of the government to compel assistance from third parties for existing wiretap orders under the Wiretap Act versus under CALIA, the ability to mandate the building of features in advance, are roughly analogous to the technical assistance notices in the Investigatory Powers Act and the Assistance and Access Bill, and the technical capabilities notices in both of those two things. And what I mean by that is that there's a distinction between, and I think we should consider these things separately. What can the government do on its own, and what would be and I think largely the kinds of promises that we see inside of the tech accord are aimed at that situation where if I were to see the government attacking a customer of mine, what we're pledging under the tech accord is we're not going to say, oh, is this a good attack on a customer of mine or a bad attack? That we will treat attacks on customers as equivalent and try to stop and block them. And then you have a whole other set of questions about what are the kinds of things that the government can demand in terms of assistance with implementing an existing order where they have a law enforcement intercept order, and then a third conversation about what are the kinds of things that the government should be able to mandate in advance in terms of the existence of features so that when they come and ask for assistance, you can't say, oh, my technology doesn't interoperate with your technology. And I think those are all three different debates. And not taking positions on where we land on any of them, but I think that they are all three separate issues.
Eric had a question in the back.
Okay, good. Thank you. Eric Novotny from American University. I'd like you to address two things, two implications of government hacking that perhaps were not covered earlier. One is if a government can get into an individual's device or a service provider's records at information at rest, it means data can be altered. And if I can alter data, I can plant evidence. That might usually give you trouble. Generally, when police plant evidence, convictions are hard to obtain. So this could actually backfire. I'd like some comments on that. And the second is on the idea of parallel construction. If I can get into a system, I might learn something that allows me to use other methods to actually entrap an individual when the actual surveillance remains covert.
I'll just say at the outset, the first one, planting evidence. I think that goes to Trey's point about trust, right? If the government can plant evidence, particularly without, no judge is going to ever authorize the government to plant evidence, right? But it does go to this whole idea of whether you can trust the information that law enforcement is putting forward, and whether people can trust that the information that they've stored is going to be intact or whether it's going to be altered. Parallel construction.
I mean, a little bit more on, we should be investing more in authentication. And being sure we can authenticate what data is held in certain databases. When the Ashley Madison, that's the service, right? When the Ashley Madison breach occurred, I was shocked that they hadn't put in fake names and credit card numbers, because all you would need to do is plant that seed of doubt. You wouldn't even need to follow up with an actual prosecution. So the importance of authenticating data in databases, I think, is true regardless of government hacking, and something companies are investing in, but something that we should be pursuing a lot greater, because even traditional data breaches are going to see implications from altering of data as they occur. On parallel construction, this has been a big issue for a while, mostly because the only remedy when the government breaches its own rules on searches and seizures is suppression of evidence. And so if you can find some other way to get it, there are problems. I think that we have needed to address that for some time and haven't. But I think that this will exacerbate that.
Okay, so our next question is from Derek Cogburn, but on the way there, we were going to take a two-finger from Laura DeNardis.
Right, I just want to add to the question that Eric raised and sort of just heap onto that question. It's not, this issue of altering content is so important. I mean, the altering of the Acosta video was a real shot across the bow on that in the White House. So deep fakes is part of it, the altering of content at all levels. But I just want to mention that that same kind of manipulation can take place at deeper levels of infrastructure, whether it's hijacking routes or using, like modifying the domain name system and the queries and doing redirection. So the authentication issue is so important at all levels of the infrastructure, not just at content.
Professor Derek Cogburn, please.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to align myself with some of Amie's earlier comments around the importance of the human rights aspects of these issues. And so when we started thinking about this panel, for me, I was really excited about talking about the protection of citizens, of individual citizens, and to think about what role the tech accord can play, what role the individual initiatives that the companies, I loved when Eric said, I'm going to protect my customers. But what is it that we're actually saying can be done? I have my own ideas about it, but what is it that we're saying can be done to protect citizens in the instance of an attack, either against them directly or against a company where their data is being stored? That's what I'm really concerned about, because it's increasing and the vulnerability is increasing, and there are additional vulnerabilities for certain populations. So I'm also the executive director of our Institute on Disability and Public Policy, and I'm particularly concerned about vulnerable populations for persons with disabilities. I'm also concerned about how, going back to Eric's comment, political attacks on, say, voter records and substitution or changing of voter records. This is a very real set of issues where individual citizens are being harmed, potentially harmed by these potentially government hacking incidents. What can actually be done in the short term to protect us and protect citizens?
Well, so I really think that this is one of the points where you do need to have norms of behavior along the lines of what Microsoft President Brad Smith was saying when he put out the call for the Digital Geneva Convention. I've never really liked the term, because I think it connotes something that is it is agreed upon in a kind of a UN level forum, but and I don't think that that's what we're looking for. But I think the idea of what Brad was saying is spot on, which is that we need to have governments understand and agree to refrain from engaging in activities that are beyond the pale. And so we need to have a clear understanding of the types of technologies that are foundational to trust when it comes to using the internet and computers. And so I referenced some of these before, the importance of not messing with digital certificates, and it relates to exactly the same issue, which is that if we allow governments to engage in activities that are going to involve changing numbers in databases, you're going to no longer be able to trust whether or not the funds that are being transferred, or there are foundational things that we need to avoid. Otherwise, we won't be able to continue to rely on these technologies in the way that we currently do. And so that's, I referenced also the importance of avoiding update mechanisms. I'll give you a quick example about this. Not messing with update mechanisms is what I mean. When the U.S. government was trying to verify the identity of Osama bin Laden in the compound in Abbottabad, they, and this was an important mission, and it was important to get it right, but in order to validate his identity and that he was in that compound, they apparently sent healthcare workers in with vaccines in order to be able to get DNA. And as a result of that, you saw a backlash in Pakistan against healthcare workers, where people were A, attacking healthcare workers, and B, refusing to get vaccines. And so there was, I'm not doubting the importance of the mission. It was pulled off, and that's great. But if there was a way to do that would not have resulted in undermining trust in the healthcare system, that would have been preferable. And so we want to avoid analogies to that in the digital world, where people will turn off the updates to their operating systems and their programs because they're afraid that this would be an avenue of attack. And we've actually seen things like this happen. There was an accounting software in Ukraine and a medical record software that were either it was the server for downloading the programs or the update mechanisms that were the vector for attack. And if those sorts of things proliferate with governments sponsoring them, then that will undermine trust in technologies in ways that we should not accept.
And I think to answer your question, there's a range of things that companies do to secure and securely deploy and maintain the security of products and services. And one of the pieces of the tech accord, one of the pillars, is discussing secure design principles with respect not just the security of data, but also its privacy and also its integrity. And I think that's a good point that's been mentioned a few times. But I want to build on Eric's comment, because it points to the kind of path-breaking incidents you've started to see more frequently in the last 5 years that have become the focal point for this kind of discussion. When you impact trust in the update mechanism, right, you're not just breaking a particular target's ability to gain additional security in response to an attack, you're breaking trust in the single or most important link that individual user has with the software company that's built those products and services. The MEDOX example is a good one, right? Whomever was behind the NotPetya incident, right? MEDOX is the most popular tax software used in the Ukraine, and it was actually that process of downloading a new version that was used to target 2.3 million Ukrainians with this piece of malware, and that then spread, because it was not just Ukrainians in Ukraine. It turned out it was companies all over the world using this software. The mechanism by which that malware was delivered into the technology ecosystem presented a massive and systemic threat, not to one target, but to many. So that's a new kind of threat to deal with, right? And the consequences of choosing that threat vector, right, present issues that companies alone are not going to be able to deal with as individual entities, which is what's leading to this kind of broader community-wide discussion. The other piece to that, though, and I think it's important to recognize, is in terms of what companies can do to respond, is also try to change the risk profile of these threats, right? By trying to drive changes in government behavior, right? It's doing more than just trying to more effectively defend customers. It's to actually try to take threats out of the ecosystem. So I think that's a really important counterpoint, is that companies are moving beyond just trying to secure themselves and their customers, but actively changing the kinds of threats they're seeing in this ecosystem. And that's a really important shift. It refers back to this kind of governance activity I was talking about at the beginning.
Any other questions and comments? I particularly want to encourage any students in the audience to join in. Please, in the back row.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on this question about evidence and how it could be manipulated. So I'm not particularly concerned in this space that law enforcement will manipulate evidence. We might have more of a problem there with intelligence agencies. But generally, where I do think we need to do more thinking is just on criminal process, related to like when hacking is used to procure evidence that might be introduced in court, what process should apply, what standards should apply, what is a defendant entitled to. So this is one area where I think we need to do a lot more thinking. I kind of bucket this. We talk about kind of different areas where we might legislate. We talked about the VEP idea. Sharon mentioned sort of a hacking statute, which I think is a question of kind of when and under what circumstances this activity might be appropriate. And then there's a whole other bucket of area of work that needs to be done on internal law enforcement process and criminal process to understand when these tools are used, what is going to happen with the evidence, what is the process that needs to be applied.
So let me follow that with a kind of comment/question. We just put a Ring camera up in a home, and it's family members in the home. And one question that came up when I was talking about what do we need to be doing on changing the law was this: what should be the process, if any, for law enforcement to be able to compel Ring to turn on that camera in that person's home? And one view was there should be no process because it shouldn't be permissible. Another view was, well, if law enforcement can break into your home secretly and plant a bug under your kitchen table, maybe it should be the same process required for turning on the camera in your home. To which somebody else said, well, it's one thing for law enforcement to put its own bug in your house, but it's another thing for them to turn your own camera against you. And then another view was, well, that's what they do when they wiretap your phone, right? They're turning your phone against you. So I think these are difficult questions, and I think that the Internet of Things makes it so that they become really important questions, and the law is not yet clear on what the standards are, nor has there been a consensus developed on what the standards ought to be.
But just one last point about it, just to put that back in the frame of what I was discussing before, which is that there is one set of questions about whether or not the government should be able to, and under what circumstances, be able to engage in its own activities to try to, if they had a wiretap order, to repurpose the technology that's already there. There's another one where because the Wiretap Act in the U.S. has authorities in it that it says that it can compel assistance from third parties. So if they were to come to the camera provider and say, we want you to try to help us, that's a second set of issues. And then the third one would be if the provider were to say, our technology is not engineered in a way that allows us to do this. And in the first one, where the government's doing this on their own, I think it would be, this would relate to whether or not the provider might decide to defend against something that they see happening that looks like it was not authorized by the user. The second one, again, is having to do with the assistance in repurposing the technology to effectuate an order. And the third one would be if the provider says, I can't help you because of the way my technology is architected. Under what circumstances should the government be able to say, well, you need to change how you're engineering your technology so that it works with my technology? Those are all different issues.
Hi, Aras from American University School of Communication. I want to go back to Professor DeNardis' point about the data collection practices by the private companies. I just don't understand how things will be different if the companies continue, doing this aggressive data collection, and if they continue designing same tools and technologies for this. Since that's the business model. I just don't understand how things will be different if this is still the case, because from Snowden revelations to currently other countries, we know that when these companies have this kind of power, both legal and extra-legal relationships are being developed between the governments and these companies. So either by cooperation or cooptation, governments are still, in quotes, hacking or being able to achieve whatever they want to do. So that's in terms of this data collection, what should companies do to avoid this?
Well, I guess I would say that it should be easier for people to understand the types of information and the amount of information that's being collected about them, and then to be able to have usable mechanisms to control that and to limit the amount the amount of time the data is retained, or to be able to correct things that are incorrect or that are no longer relevant. And I think this is a debate that we need to have in this country, that we have not had, about whether or not there should be a baseline set of privacy requirements that fill the gaps between the specific verticals that we have now for highly sensitive types of information. And I think that debate is coming because of the fact that so many U.S. companies are doing business abroad and already having to comply with the GDPR in Europe, and then we have the California law that's going to be coming into effect in 2020. So it's always a good bet that Congress is not going to do anything on a particular issue. But I do think that this is an area where there may be some growing consensus that we need. And I've seen growing numbers of trade associations and companies, I see Jeff again over there, including Apple, who have specifically called for the development of legislation. And so, this is a debate that we need to have.
I want to sneak in one last question from the audience, and then we'll give the panel a final round of comments to wrap us up. So please.
Hi, my name is Ashwita. I'm a PhD student at the School of Communication as well. I guess my question is, when we talk about private sector efforts, we seem to be focusing a lot on big tech companies, the Apples, the Ciscos, Microsofts, et cetera, but we are not talking about, like, for example, the startup companies that are using facial recognition and AI and whose technology is being used by the government. We're not talking about defense contractors who are providing their services to the governments. Why? I don't know if there's like a blanket solution that's going to fit all of these. I would like to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
It's a fantastic point, and I think it goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that there's a tremendous diversity of entities when we talk about what the private sector is. This is one set of discussions that has started in the sort of traditional tech community, and I think it has a lot of application for problems that companies like Microsoft and Cisco and Airbus are facing. But your question is absolutely the right one. I mean, I think the kinds of values and the kinds of principles that are coming out of these conversations should absolutely be transposed into spaces where large technology companies do not have the same leadership role. The defense industry that you're talking about, I think in particular the startup community, right? Those working with personally identifiable information as a sort of wacky vertical absolutely should be part of the dialogue. The challenge, I think, is twofold. First, often the smallest tech companies, I'm thinking about, there's a huge application for the kinds of problems you're talking about with companies building image processing systems for LiDAR, right, and autonomous vehicles. And these are usually 10, 15, 20-person shops that don't have a policy office, let alone a government affairs team or anyone to really sort of sit and think about this. So how do we provide an opportunity for those kinds of companies to address these issues? Where is a set of principles, right, that perhaps an enterprising young PhD student might be able to say, this is the dissertation that argues how these companies think about this problem without having to staff it with 12 full-time employees? Right, here's a set of values or a set of engineering principles or even a set of design decisions that you can make. Here's the decision tree. And as you go farther over in this direction, you're engaged in these kinds of risks. As you go farther over here, you might engage in these kinds of benefits. That kind of resource, those sorts of knowledgeable materials would be, I think, a big benefit to those sorts of entities. Defense industry is a different proposition, and it's one where you have to think a little bit more aggressively about how you're designing a market that incentivizes them to make the right kinds of choices in this context. There was this is on a collateral topic, but there was a paper that came out from MITRE a couple of months ago called Deliver Uncompromised. It was talking about the efforts government, specifically the U.S. government and the defense community, could bring to bear on vendors to drive change in how they build products and the security of those products with respect to the supply chain of components that are going into them. Without talking about the supply chain, that kind of thinking about how government acquisitions authority and procurement officers can drive change in companies that do a tremendous amount of government business is a potential lever for the kinds of change you're talking about that might be more effective there than with a 12-person startup. So I think, it's a good conversation. What do we know? How do we communicate? And what are the incentives for it? But it's a good question for sure.
All right, mindful of time, I want to make sure we give our panelists kind of a last opportunity for a closing comment. before I do that, I want to thank all of you for attending today. A really fantastic discussion. I want to thank Ken Merrill at the Internet Governance Lab, especially for his work doing a lot of the local organizing and hosting. And finally, very importantly, I want to thank the Internet Society and Dustin Phillips in particular for making the live stream possible today, that will let this hopefully reach a nice big audience online and share with a broader community this really important and timely discussion. So thank you to everyone for those contributions. And I will now sort of turn it over to the panel, and I think maybe we'll start from the opposite end. We'll start with Laura, and we will make our way back down in order just as we go down to Eric.
Thanks, Mark. Final thought. The same exact technologies that are used for authoritarian social control are used for legitimate law enforcement and national security in all societies, and that complicates the issue. So one person's hacking is another person's network investigative techniques, right? And I say that because it's important to just acknowledge that values are the decision factor. And these private sector initiatives are just putting that on the table and acknowledging that they're multinational companies. They do business in many different countries, and they're making values decisions, or they're acknowledging that they have to make values decisions as part of the multi-stakeholder internet governance regime. So I just want to echo Mark in thanking everyone for coming. Come join the Internet Governance Lab at many of our events, and I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Fantastic. Amie, final thoughts.
I think Laura, when we started it, hit the nail on the head, is that this situation is getting so much more complicated, and Greg brought up the ring, but it's connected bridges and connected dams and connected tractors that are controlling our food supply and could put us into a critical state of not having enough food to feed the country or the world if the wrong person hacks into the system. And so I think the stakes are very high here, and I think asking the question about how to protect people is the right thing and what needs to be written into law, and I think law needs to absolutely be a piece of this. Affirmative obligations for startups and defense contractors and every level of company, and then what companies need to affirmatively exactly commit to doing, so that getting to the implementation of these documents is going to be absolutely vital to make sure that people are protected and don't become massive collateral damage in global conflict.
A few wrap-up thoughts. First, I think your question was a really good one, which is pointing out that if the data isn't there, if it isn't retained, it can't be stolen, it can't be shared, and it can't be compelled by the government. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So in addition to company data control practices, I think we need a legal regime that prevents or controls government demands on providers to give the kind of assistance that we're finding troubling. I think there needs to be authority in the provider to deny those demands, to deny jurisdiction when they can do that, and authority to push back in court on the unlawful demands. I think there needs to be strengthened security as well, so that even if the government attack does happen, and even if one provider is assisting with an objectionable attack, it doesn't matter because the data has been secured, or it matters less.
The point I'd want to close with, or to leave you guys with, is we've had a lot of discussion about what companies are doing and the way technology impacts these sorts of discussions today, and I wouldn't want you to leave thinking that this wasn't entirely a political process, and this wasn't a political debate, and that as a result, you all have a direct stake in it. The means by which you are able to influence that debate and the mechanisms of control that you have over technology companies obviously are different from those with governments, but this is emphatically one that involves all of your security, all of our privacy, right? All of our ability to use and to trust this technology. And taking a direct and active stake in that is important for determining how these debates fall out and how these values are shaped. This is a very early stage for a lot of these discussions. There's a tremendous amount of things that are still up in the air. So to the extent to which you see these as something that are sort of removed from your domain or issues of high politics, I think is a mistake. Technology companies are emphatically political actors, and you all are subject to the kinds of decisions that we make and that you make and that states make. So get out there and understand what these are and how they impact you, and find a way to influence this process, because it is absolutely going to determine. Laura talked about this beautiful internet that we've had for the last 30 years. This thing is changing. It's changing fast. And what we have left, and what we have left for our children, et cetera, is going to be determined in the next 10 to 15 years.
So I wish we had a little bit more time to dig into the ideas that Laura put out on the table. I think really the most fascinating one that we've kind of danced around a little bit, but need to give more consideration to, is the fact that we've moved from an environment where we have taken essentially thoughts that we had in our brains and on paper and put them into computers, and then put those computers in a place where they're connected to the cloud, and then what are the implications for the government being able to access that information and the intrusiveness of that, to then connecting those computers up to devices that are all over our homes and around our lives, which are then collecting information and then moving them up to the cloud, and then all the processing and the AI and machine learning that comes out of that. But specifically related to this, I mean, I think what we have hit upon here today is that our lives are inextricably linked around this technology now, and we have companies that are in a position where they're holding information that governments are trying to access, and we need to have an open conversation about what are the rules that should govern both the company's security for that information, their ability to use it for their business models, that's the privacy conversation, but also the rules that should govern the behavior of governments around trying to gain access to that information. And as I said before, I put that into the three categories, which is the government's acting on their own, the government's seeking assistance from the companies in order to effectuate lawful orders that they have, and then the government's making demands for how technology should be architected. And I would echo Trey's point, which is that you should all get involved and to ask questions and to raise concerns.
Terrific. Thank you all for participating in the panel. For participants who are staying for the workshop to follow, we will still take a little bit of a break. Even though we've run a bit long, we'll give you a bit longer break, and we will convene in about 15 minutes. So please hang around for that. And thank you again to all of you for joining us today.